Well, good morning, and thanks so much for tuning in here on this Wednesday morning. I'm Ryan Kouchi, joined by Yanji Denise. This is Spotlight Hawaii on the platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser. Thanks so much for joining us. This morning, Yanji, we have two very important leaders who are making some very big decisions at a critical point right now for our state.
That's absolutely right. We are joined live from the state capitol by Senate President Ron Kouchi, along with House Speaker Scott Saiki. We appreciate both of you being here this morning. There's been so much in the news. Let's, of course, start with these overrides that happened yesterday. Mr. Speaker, I want to start with you. Defunding the Hawaii Tourism Authority. Why did lawmakers feel that this was the right move to make, especially at a time when so many are calling for tourism to have more oversight rather than less?
Right. So, Yanji, yesterday, the House and the Senate did override House Bill 862, which restored some funding for the Hawaii Tourism Authority. We appropriated $60 million out of the federal ARPA funds to go to the HTA operations. And, as far as the HTA is concerned, I think there's more and more, discussion and scrutiny within the general public on proper tourism management in the state of Hawaii and the role that the HTA plays in that management. I think that this is an important discussion for all of us because as we begin to see tourism numbers increase, there needs to be better management and there needs to be better oversight over how tourism is affecting Hawaii residents on a daily basis.
And Senate President, if you want to expand a little more on that, but specifically, I wanted to ask, one of the things that also changes is the mechanism and the funding of TAT and the allocations of those funds. We know that Kauai could be impacted by this, an island that you represent. What are your thoughts about the county's responsibility now in this role of the TAT and the restructuring of how the counties will be allocated this funding?
Well, the counties have been capped at the 103 million with the percentages that they share. This gives them an opportunity to see their revenue stream grow if the visitor spending numbers grow, so that allows them to keep up with the amount of tourists and the spending that's occurring and a more predictable source instead of coming back to us every year. But we are saying fundamentally the relationship is changing, and as more and more visitors are coming here, they're a lot more independent. They're not in tour buses and moving around in organized groups. They create impacts, and visitors should be paying for more of the impacts that they're creating on our infrastructure, our natural resources. And we don't believe that the residents should be bearing that much of the burden anymore.
Mr. President, I want to follow up a little bit on what I had just asked Speaker Saiki. What do you think is the appropriate role of the Hawaii Tourism Authority? What do you think they should be doing, given that now they will have less funding, going from 72 million down to 62 million, and having to come to the state every year to ask for money? What do you think is the appropriate role of that agency?
Well, what we're hoping for is that we're going to see a better collaboration between HTA, the visitor industry, the legislature, as well as the general public. And, before we get to the point where we have incredible pushback from residents and, really hurt our brand by, having people who are unhappy with the visitors movement, we need to all be at the table working together. I think this creates a pathway for that to occur.
Speaker, one of the things, of course, that this bill does is there is a lot of talk about passing that buck on to visitors, but we also recognize and realize that local residents will also be impacted by this because visitors aren't the only one that utilize hotels and are a part of our hospitality industry. In fact, many in the hospitality industry survived during the Kama'aina economy during the pandemic, but yet now local residents who may be visiting family members on neighbor islands are being asked to also see this increase in TAT. Has there been any consideration to exempt local residents from having to pay the TAT, and why was that maybe not considered as part of this mechanism?
Yeah, so the legislation that we approved does not address how to treat local residents when it comes to these kinds of fees. I think that it would have been difficult to do that in legislation because there would have probably been legal challenges if we favored residents over non-residents. I think there would have been a litigation over that. So we were not able to address that. Although I think that when you look at another piece of legislation that we approved, which was the bill that allows the DLNR to assess fees for parks and other natural resources. Once the DLNR begins to implement that program, they can probably look at ways to exempt residents, just like the City and County of Honolulu does when it comes to the fees that are being charged at Hanuma Bay. But as far as relief for residents, we do realize that residents will also be caught up paying for some of these fees, and we'll be revisiting this issue next session to see if there's a way that we can provide some relief for them.
And Ryan, I would just add very quickly, you mentioned about the kama'aina rate. So generally, the residents would be paying a lower room rate for the same room than a visitor would be paying. So their tax would be less than what the visitor tax burden would be.
I want to bring in this point from Miguel, which is something that we've heard again and again. He says, Hawaii at this point needs more quality tourists, not quantity. Mr. Speaker, how do you think we get there? Is it by levying fees? Is it through the DLNR and others, sort of taxing people in all different kinds of ways? Or how do we get that so-called champagne tourist, if you will?
Yeah, I think that, assessing more fees will provide, some relief in that area. But I also think that it's important for us to see how we can target certain kinds of tourists. And that's something that maybe the HTA could assist us with. The HTA was originally created, I think, with the primary mission of marketing Hawaii. I think that we need to revisit that part of HTA's mission. I'm not sure that tourism needs to be marketed here anymore, as we see now with the numbers increasing so rapidly. But I think that HTA has to help us be more strategic in how we target and the kinds of visitors that we want to target for Hawaii.
Speaker, one of the things that is also comes up with this bill specifically is just the overall collection of this new tax and placing that burden now on the counties. Actually, let me go over to Senate President, if you want to address this question first. The state is currently the one that is collecting the county's taxes, like the TAT and GAT, that then gets dispersed to the counties. Why did you feel like it was important that the county should become the tax collectors now instead of the state? Because isn't that just adding another layer now that the counties are responsible for collecting this? And from a logistical standpoint, do you think that the counties are equipped to be able to take on this role given this new structuring?
I think the most important fundamental point is that you wanted to get the taxes collected at the point of the booking. And so the money would stay in the county where the activity is occurring. As the speaker said, if we need to revisit how this would work and somebody has a better suggestion, we're open to looking at it, but we need to start, we need to get going, and we want to be sure that the money is being collected where the reservations are being generated and the people are staying.
Ryan, if I could just add that, we could also take a look at the current system that is set up at the state tax department, where the tax department collects the GET surcharge that is imposed at the county level. What the tax department does is it collects those funds and then disperses it to the respective counties. So that is one mechanism that we could explore when it comes to the hotel room tax.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to follow on something you said about Hawaii perhaps no longer needing any marketing, that sort of the word is out about our great state and that we don't necessarily need to advertise. Does that mean, do you think that there is no role for the HTA? Do you foresee a possibility at some point in the future where the HTA does not exist?
I think the HTA, like many other government agencies, needs to really reassess and refine its role so that it's just more on point, it's more strategic, and that it's able to address the needs that are facing our state now and in the future. And I think that tourism management is an issue that we need to address, and the HTA needs to step up and let us know how it can play a role in managing tourism as opposed to just promoting tourism. And there's a big difference there. And as I mentioned earlier, are seeing now that we don't really have to market Hawaii in order to bring visitors here.
But I think, Yanji, one of the areas that they still can play a critical role is in the promotion and support of the cultural events in the various communities. Just speaking on Kauai, the Kuloa Plantation Days, or Waimea in February has their Waimea Town event. People plan class reunions or family reunions to return besides visitors coming, but these cultural events create opportunities for visitors to make choices to come and visit the islands because they're interested in the events that are going on. Obviously, the Merry Monarch is at an international level of exposure. And so, certainly ensuring that we get that mix, we support the cultural activities in our community, and we are putting out a quality product for the residents and the visitors alike is going to be important in that management of tourism.
Another part of this bill that I think sometimes may have gotten overlooked was the role of the convention center. And this bill also limits the convention center to no more than $11 million a year. Now, traditionally, in looking back at some of the numbers, the center is close to bringing in $55 million a year. Is limiting groups coming into the state and conventions part of the plan by the state to strategically control visitors? Speaker, we'll start with you and your thoughts of the role of the convention center and this cut in funding for the convention center.
Yeah, so that amount was based upon the current and the near term projections for the use of the convention center. So that's an amount that could always be adjusted if we see an influx in bookings. So obviously during the pandemic, there was virtually no activity there other than the unemployment center that was set up at the convention center. I'm not sure how many years the convention center has been here. I think maybe 30 years or so. I'm not sure if it's reached its full potential yet. It seems like the bookings have been limited, and we've even seen some large conventions being canceled. And that was prior to the pandemic. So we also need to take a hard look at how the convention center can help attract the kind of visitors that we want here.
Senator Kouchi, I would love you to sort of expand on that as well.
I think the only thing to add is that the business travel market or conventions have been changing. And as long as we have certain social distancing requirements, even as we raise capacity in facilities, you've heard the restaurateurs say 75% capacity, but if we need 6-foot distancing, doesn't allow me to bring in any more people. And so, when are they going to see the resumption of business travel is something that we, as the speaker said, need to monitor and work with them. If it does come back, we would certainly commit more funds to it. But right now, there's very limited convention and business travel. And the governor, as he's stated on your show, is taking a more conservative approach. So some conventions have chosen not to come here because they're not assured they could get all of the people in the room that they want. Until we hit 70% vaccination rates and see a change in the marketplace, that's a real big challenge for us. And that's not a market that's thriving right now.
One of the points that were made from the hospitality leaders that we spoke to here on this program, some of their comments was the way in which this bill was passed and the mechanisms that were used to have this discussion behind closed doors, that they really didn't have the opportunity or the time because of the nature and the timing in which some of this language was introduced into this bill. I wanted to get your thoughts, Speaker. We'll start with you on critics and what they're saying happened behind closed doors, that there wasn't enough transparency with this bill, that hospitality leaders weren't given the opportunity to advocate for this. And for someone like John DeFries, who's the president of the Hawaii Tourism Authority, who's been on the job for 6 months now, don't you think that this creates a little more restriction on his role and what he's able to do after he outlined his plan, but all these changes happening without much say from those in the hospitality industry?
Yes, I think there's always room for more public participation when it comes to legislation. I'm not sure whether a topic like this is going to ever reach a point where you have compromise or buy-in on a broader basis. I think that the issues that were addressed in this bill are issues that have been on the table, that have been discussed publicly with industry and others for several years now. The tax equity issues, tourism management, all of that has been discussed for several years now. As far as John DeFries, John is a great guy. I have a lot of confidence in him, and I know that he has already worked to reform the HTA, to improve the HTA. He announced a few days ago a restructuring plan at the staff level at HTA. I think that we will be working very closely with him going forward to improve HTA and the tourism management.
I want to ask a few questions, if I could, about another bill that was overridden, and that has to do with COVID reporting in schools. Senate President, why did you feel like this was something that was necessary to override? For background for our audience, this is the bill that requires schools to report COVID cases at their complex areas, as opposed to just keeping it general. Some schools have said that this is, and the governor said that this is a concern about HIPAA laws and privacy, and perhaps not wanting to alienate students who might test positive for the coronavirus. But why did you think this was necessary to actually have reporting down to the school level?
Well, and actually right now they're reporting by complex area. So they would just say there was one positive case in the Kauai complex, which consists of 3 high schools, 3 middle schools, and 9 elementary schools. At this point, when we're trying to do the contact tracing and let people know if they were in that school area, that maybe they would want to check in, maybe they want to go in and get testing. There's still free testing available at the Kauai Convention Hall, at least in my district. And at that point, it doesn't violate HIPAA. It doesn't talk about any individual. And then when we were getting positive cases in the schools on Kauai, all you got to do is go to Facebook, and you'd find out before the press release came out from the DOH what school had the positive test. The other concern that I have, and why I supported this bill, is that we're resuming in-person instruction again, and we haven't approved vaccinations for children 12 and under. And so I think it's important for parents to feel confident that they're getting the information they need to ensure the safety of their children. And then certainly for the safety of the teachers and all of the other support employees in a school.
There were reports of those students who were identified in schools as the candidate or the person that had COVID-19. And there were reports of cyberbullying that happened to these students because they tested positive. Speaker, are you concerned at all for the safety and well-being of these students who may be ostracized for getting COVID-19 after being identified by a school? And in some of the rural communities, when it is people are able to use Facebook and other social media platforms to identify the names specifically of the students and anything that may come along with some of the ramifications of that.
Yeah, we're absolutely concerned about student privacy. That is our number one concern when it comes to reporting of this kind of data. As the Senate President mentioned, this information can be disclosed without revealing identities and other personal information. I just want to add that we've been having a back and forth with the Health Department on disclosure of COVID data since January, and we have been requesting that the Health Department provide more specific information to the public. And at that time, the requests weren't really focused on schools, but just on outbreaks and clusters and the source, the source of COVID cases in Hawaii. And the rationale for that request was that specific information is actually helpful to the public, that it will provide more information to the public so that the public can take better precautions, can exercise safety protocols. I think people will behave differently if they're provided more specific information. And when it comes to this legislation on schools, we the law will not require will protect student privacy and identification.
Just a quick follow-up, if I can, on that bill. There was also no sunset date that was also set on that bill. So this essentially could go on forever, where schools are now having to report this case in their school. Is that something that you would look to consider altering at some point in time? Or do you think that it's important that we continue to have this in the statute forever, essentially?
Yeah, we could absolutely revisit the whether there's a need for a sunset date. I mean, we'll have to see, what happens over the next year, a couple of years, and the legislature can revisit that.
I have a question I'd love for both of you to ask, and that is just that, the overrides that we saw and that we are continuing to expect tomorrow, amount to the most vetoes rejected by lawmakers of any Democratic governor in Hawaii's history. You folks are part of the same party. What should people take away from this disagreement between the executive branch and the legislative branch? Mr. Speaker, we'll start with you.
Well, the legislature is more independent, and while we work with the governor very closely on a number of issues, we also agree to disagree with him on a number of issues. And I think that's what you saw through this override session. The governor had originally identified 26 bills that he wanted to veto. Many of those bills were passed unanimously by the legislature. And, we're somewhat disappointed that the governor didn't really provide us with, specific explanations for why he wanted to veto those bills leading up to the override session. And so, we had really no choice but to override yesterday. And when we chose bills that were important to both the House and the Senate, we did not override all of the bills that were vetoed. We vetoed. We'll be overriding 9 of the vetoed bills out of 2026.
And Senate President, same question. What should we take away from this obvious tension between the two branches of government?
That the democracy is alive and well. That everybody feels that they have the ability to speak freely, express their personal point of view without retribution. And as the speaker said, we view these differently. I think it's interesting. One of the bills was the Made in Hawaii brand. Another one, was about electronic reporting. Another one we talked about at length was the COVID reporting in schools. And about the microchip in dogs and cats. So none of the bills that we chose to override were bills that contained any of the money other than 862 and how the HTA would operate going forward and the counties. And so a lot of the bills the governor vetoed were because the financial situation changed since the legislature adjourned, and we agreed with him. So there's a lot that we agreed on, but there are some policy things that we had a disagreement and led to, the overrides that we have. And again, it's a small portion, and 28 bills that he sent up on the 35th day on his intent to veto list. That's also a lot more than he has sent up in the past.
I do want to follow up on one of those bills that you talk about, SB 404, which is the bill that would exempt candidates from certain political advertising disclosures, which require campaigns essentially to report these types of ads. There was just the overall intent. It was a cumbersome bill, and we know that the intent was really to help campaigns through this filing process, but ultimately it was to help to promote more transparency. Senate President, don't you think that would be something that we should advocate more for, is transparency, especially when it comes to campaigns and where this money is coming from? What was the reasoning behind vetoing that, overriding that veto?
Well, you still have the requirement to report. So when you say exempting, it's from one of the reports. We do it. A lot of new candidates unaware of the law wound up, being fined because they didn't do it. We're still required to do the reports, and they're available and everybody can see that. So we think that the amount that was suggested would be satisfactory, and we disagreed about that.
Yeah, Ryan, if I could just add something, the legislature does support transparency, and that's why we enacted this requirement of about 5 years ago. This has only been on the books for a few years. When we approved this legislation originally, the intent was for it to apply to PACs, political action committees, and because we saw that PACs were sending out flyers and running commercials on television and on radio in the last few days of a campaign. And so the purpose of this legislation was to require PACs to report these communications before they were mailed or aired. And unfortunately, what happened was candidate committees were also required to make these reports. So basically, what we've done is we've clarified that candidate committees do have to disclose these expenditures when they submit their regular campaign spending report. So there is still a reporting requirement. It's just that these reports are made after the fact, as opposed to before the communication is mailed or aired.
Yunji's actually muted right now. She seems it's once a show. It's once a show she has that problem.
We know that the governor obviously will term out at the end of very soon, but we still have one more legislative session with this legislature and this governor. So can you characterize the working relationship that you have, Senate President? We'll start with you. And do you think that we can expect more tension as we've seen, or are you able to work together?
I was up in his office at 3:30 yesterday afternoon when we had gavelled out talking about upcoming legislation. And, I feel personally that I've had a good relationship. He knows my children. I know his children. My son Dan and his daughter Lauren in particular are friends. They were in DC. But I still can disagree without having tension or without having a bad relationship with the governor. I was elected to do the job as I see fit, as was he.
And Speaker Saiki, same question.
Yes, along the lines of what the president just said, the House and the governor have, an open door policy. The governor knows that he can call us at any time. We call him frequently. We're able to sit down and talk with him. And, as I mentioned earlier, we agree to disagree at times, but I think that our conversations, our discussions are always pretty civil and constructive.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. We thank you so much, both Senate President and House Speaker, for being a part of this conversation. We know that you folks will have another busy day tomorrow as you head back into session to go over some of those other overrides and amendments. But we certainly appreciate you taking time this morning to inform us on some of the decisions that were made yesterday. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Aloha.
Thank you.
Well, interesting just to hear the thought process there, Ryan. We hear that both lawmakers basically saying that, yes, they have a good working relationship, they can work together, but they are independent minded and they want to speak for their constituents. And that's what they believe they did by overriding all of these vetoes.
Yeah, and no doubt the bill and the override that made the most waves and headlines was the change to the funding mechanism, of course, for the Hawaii Tourism Authority, and changes to the TAT structure in which the state and counties now will have to restructure that. One of the questions that I had early on was the impact that it would have to local residents, noting that Kama'ainas will still have to end up paying more money now for services like having a staycation in Waikiki. The speaker going on to say that they will be potentially looking at efforts to see if there are ways to provide more assistance or change that support in the future. But right now, they couldn't really identify or specifically target those local residents under state statute and law to identify them residents as opposed to visitors. And so we'll have to see if any changes are made there to help alleviate some of the costs that local residents would have to pay for this change in the TAT.
Yeah, and you really heard there from both men, particularly Speaker Saiki, kind of a rethinking of the HTA's role that, basically saying Hawaii doesn't necessarily need to market itself anymore. Tourism does need to be managed. And so what role the HTA plays It sounds like they want to reevaluate that altogether, and cutting off this automatic funding and having it basically be independent is no more. So HTA, like other state agencies, will have to go to the ledge every year and ask for money. They've gone from 72 now to $60 million this year, largely funded with federal monies. But next legislative session, John DeFreeze and the rest of his leadership there will have to go to the legislators and ask for money. And you really just see a rethinking of what that agency is and what the role will be. It's very unclear right now what the expectation is.
And really, it's become a common thread in this last legislative session, and we've talked to Sylvia Luke about this on this program in the past, is the way in which the legislature is now handling these special funds, which of course, a lot of them were set up to include specific funding mechanisms for organizations and entities like the HTA. But by doing away with these special funds, a lot of the money is now going back into the general fund, which would then give essentially lawmakers more authority and more power to decide how they allocate this funding moving forward for organizations. And so we'll see if we continue to see this depletion and this changing of all these special funds that currently exist within the state budget, and more money being put into the general fund, and moving forward, how the legislature will plan on distributing those allocations in the future.
Right. And you also heard them talk about their thinking when it came to school disclosures regarding COVID-19. We are actually going to be talking with the new head of the Hawaii State Teachers Association. That, of course, is Osatui Jr. He took over for Corey Rosenlee, and we are very excited to speak with him. We'll be speaking with him on Friday about this measure and also the rest of back to school. Students will be back in person in less than a month. What does that look like? How do teachers feel about essentially given an all or nothing choice, the DOE really not creating an option for distance learning for teachers or for students? So how do they feel about going back full time? We'll be talking about that on Friday right here at 10:30.
That's right. And then next week, another slew of guests that we'll be having right here on this program, including a kind of Where Are They Now segment. We are going to be catching up with former Honolulu Mayor Kirk Caldwell. We've been trying to get current Mayor Rick Blangiardi on this program. Unfortunately, he's had to reschedule a number of times. So we're going to hear from our former mayor to hear about what he's been up to and some of the decisions that are being made by this current administration, and get his thoughts on the future, his own political future moving forward. So a lot to look forward to here on this program. We thank you all for being a part of this conversation. We'll see you all right back here at 10:30 on Friday. Aloha.
Aloha.